This week's guest, born in London in the early 50s, totally naive to the fact that his future would take him halfway across the world, down under to the shores of Australia. After excelling at school with a strong passion for theatre, an unexpected twist happened, resulting in a pivot from acting to business. In 1985, he co-founded Morgan and Banks, and what started as a small operation grew into a recruitment empire, commanding 17% of the Australian and Asian market, ultimately going public, generating over $900 million in sales before merging with US-based NASDAQ-listed company. Andrew went on to globally be responsible for 50-plus acquisitions, over 4,500 staff, spanning 32 countries. In 2002, upon returning to Sydney, Australia, Andrew continued to build and invest in many other companies, expanding his reach and shaping industries along the way. And if you caught him as a shark on Shark Tank Australia, you know his sharp eye for talent and investment hasn't dulled one bit. From his early days in theatre to boardrooms all around the world, Andrew's journey is one of grit, ambition, and an unmistakable drive to make his mark. So sit back and get ready to dive into a conversation with Australian icon, Andrew Banks. Welcome to World Class Voices.
Good to be here.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming in.
Not at all.
We've got so much to get into today.
Right.
I want to kick this off. You're the man of people. Business is about people. You know, you're communicating with staff, with customers, with suppliers, with investors, and your whole career has been based around people. I would love to understand what that means to you and how and what you've learnt about people in business.
Well, I think life is about people, isn't it? You know, it's a bit of a lonely planet if you're the only one on it. So I think communication with people and winning them over, let's face it, we all want to go through life and have people helping us, not hurting us. So I think you learn early on in life that, you know, developing relationships, listening, developing empathy is helpful, because if people like you and are encouraged by you and encourage you, then life goes more easily than if suddenly you're... So I think, you know, the people thing started early. I have 5 brothers. I grew up in a very warm, loving family in England. And I think, you know, I sort of got the EQ lessons through my family upbringing. And so that then translates later on into your career. Obviously, you know, to get things done, you need people to support you and be with you. And I think an early lesson was be interested, not interesting, which is if you know, project yourself and get people to say, tell me about yourself and show interest, then they will reciprocate.
Yes. Take us back to, well, really the 60s. You're in England, you have 5 siblings, military father. What does that world look like? What was the first kind of 10, 15, 20 years of Andrew's life?
Well, growing up in Chichester in a country town, riding a bike to school, small country town, I think that helped me adapt to Australia, because country England and Australia are much closer than, say, London and Australia, which is a big city. But pretty normal. I went to a state school, you know, grammar school as they used to call it, in the country. You know, that's where I learned to sail. I could probably sail before I could swim or walk, maybe sail, certainly swim. And life was good. You know, older brothers at school, which meant no one touched me. Keep your hands off Banks, you know, otherwise you're in trouble. So it's nice having a few older brothers in the same school. I was number 5. My father was actually a pharmacist, but he was in the medical corps, which is where he met my mother. And, you know, they were typical post-war family, you know, make sure you eat all the food on your plate, you know. If you're not being shot at and you've got food in your stomach and a roof over your head, you don't really have a problem. Everything else is academic. So that speaks a little bit to my lack of risk aversion. Mm-hmm. You know, I think I kind of grew up thinking, you know, business and losing money was not really risky stuff. You know, getting shot at and survival, basic survival was more important. So,
right. And you mentioned you went to a state school.
Yeah.
So, it's an interesting topic. Universities in 2024 are very, very different to what they were in the
Yeah.
60s and 70s.
Yeah.
I would love to understand what you think about state education, private education, but also just education as a whole, the need for it. The interesting piece, I had a conversation with Glenn earlier in the week, and Glenn's an interesting guy because he's got that academic background, but he's also a serial entrepreneur. And so often those two kind of skill sets don't overlap.
If you're purely academic, yeah. Well, I'm a failed doctor, so I did a year of medicine, dropped out, then a year of applied biology. I passed exams, but I finished, and then I immigrated to Australia because they said, look, for 10 quid, you look like a good guy, you don't have tuberculosis, we'll let you in. So I thought, I've got to find myself. So, but back to your question on education, I mean, education is an asset to anyone's life and success. But I don't think universities are the standard that we should be measuring that by, because, a great motor mechanic or a great electrician is very valuable to this society. So I think for an individual, who's younger and asking themselves, what sort of education do I want? It's all about what's your career direction, what are you passionate about? Where do you think you're going? And then make sure you get the theoretical knowledge, which is education, as well as the practical knowledge, tacit knowledge from doing things, and get as much of that as you can. And if that leads to a degree because you want to be a lawyer or a doctor, fine. But it may not just be an education, it may be other forms. But I think anybody who thinks they're going to be successful in a field, if you don't know everything there is to know about that field, is at a disadvantage. And so that's where theoretical education comes in. But I'm a great believer in practical, tacit knowledge, the stuff you learn from doing things.
Yeah, and I think a big difference as well is the access to information.
Yeah.
Back
These
in
days,
the day.
exactly. You can do a
library.
degree online, do a lot of stuff, learn from podcasts. I listen to the All In podcast, which is the Silicon Valley guy. Sensational. And I mean, that's a different kind of learning and education, but it's still valid.
Absolutely. Do you consider yourself a competitive man?
I think I'm competitive in the sense with myself. I think that brings us on to the subject of good and evil, which you weren't expecting. When I listen to people talking about their careers and their success, I'm listening often for language which is telling me that they believe their success must be at the expense of others. For me to succeed, others must fail. That's evil. It's a very small percentage of the population, but you can hear it in language. It's all about me. So I'm a great believer. I like to compete with myself. I think that's the biggest driver for me. I'm always trying to be better at something, whether it's golf or making money or doing a great interview. So that kind of competition is definitely, and I think Five Brothers and growing up in a sporty world as well, but not the kind of competitiveness where I want to beat everyone else. I'm a bit wary of that, if that's the sole driver of your competitive spirit. Now, as a company, I want to beat everyone else, but not as an individual. And I don't mind, winning, but I want to bring others with me, not have them pushed down for me to win. Do you understand?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting distinguishment to make, the company and the individual.
Yeah. I mean, and I think, I'm a very enthusiastic 73-year-old, and a lot of people think, that's unusual. 73, like when my dad was 73, was kind of, not quite as upbeat as probably I am today. And I think partly good health, the world we live in, but I think it's definitely about positive attitude, So I want to stay positive until the lights go out,
Totally. One of the lines you told me off air was positive culture eats strategy for breakfast.
Good culture, yeah. Culture eats strategy. Yeah, I like that. That's I think it's a Drucker statement, so I think I probably stole it from him. Peter Drucker's passed away now, but a famous guru. But I think what I meant by that was, Morgan and Banks, for example, one of my first public companies, we were 2,500 people. And I always remember, because we were listed, we had analysts, and they used to come around the company. And one of them asked me one day, your people are all so enthusiastic and they're all so upbeat. Who trains them? And I intuitively said, their mothers do. And he said, what do you mean by that? And I said, well, we hire on fit first, cultural fit. These human beings, they join us in this recruiting company because that's what they want to do at this moment in their life. We don't hire their resumes, we hire the person, and then we train them to do the job, the skills. So I always felt that that's what made Morgan & Bank so successful. We were 17% of the market. By the way, no recruiting company in any country has ever had that market share. Nini of just under $1 billion in revenue. So I always think of that culture as why we were so successful. Everybody who joined us was a fit. And so, you could say they drank the Kool-Aid, whatever, but they loved what they did. And so we were very unstoppable. And I think that beats a great strategy to be market leader. Because you can have a strategy and everybody can agree to it. But then if secretly half of the company aren't really aligned, they don't want to be there, they're there for the wrong reasons. If you think Andrew Banks and Jeff Morgan are full of bullshit and, it sounds great, but I'm really only here for the money, then you're not going to do as well.
In what ways do you think the human resources recruitment space has changed? We're in the 20s now of the new century. Yeah. Where have you seen the core changes?
Well, I think, and this leads to technology and the digital age, but because I was one of the first to put jobs online, Job Hound, and then when we merged on the NASDAQ, we were monster.com, which was the biggest job site in the US. So I think that was finding candidates, sourcing them, but I think, recruitment and HR is still very important in selecting them, and that's down to the person. So I think the generic personal skills become more and more important because, 15 years ago, we would have said to young kids, programming, that's where you got to be, right? Programming. Well, today you could argue that actually you don't have to be a programmer because AI will disintermediate programming. It'll all be done with language and the AI will then do the coding, as it were. So technical skills will be more transient. Personal skills of, persuasion, being able to relate, connecting the dots of what technology provides and arriving at a conclusion, which is, making a price in a dealing room would be that. The systems will all give you what the market's doing, but making a price is a very human decision to say, right, that's the right strike price to buy or sell this item. Those qualities, I think, will become more important.
And was there a different approach with smaller business recruitment versus larger corporation recruitment in terms of selection?
Well, I think smaller businesses require more generalized skills. So you need people who are flexible. The job descriptions are blurred at the border because if you're in a small company with 5 or 10 people, you don't go, excuse me, I'm in accounts. I don't pick up the phone and talk to a customer.
You've got to wear multiple hats.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a great training for people. And of course, we were a small business. We were 12 and then we were 50 and then we were 150 and suddenly we were 2,000. So everyone's jobs changed. We had to grow into those bigger jobs. Larger businesses are more structured. So I think for young people joining them, you'll get probably very good training. You'll be put on a conveyor belt. But then, if I'm sitting here reflecting on candidate interviews, why would people leave larger structured companies and go to smaller companies? Because they want a broader role and more involvement and feeling like they're more involved in the decision-making process. So, different stages in life. I don't think small or large is good or bad, but see them for what they are.
Well, one of the things I'm fascinated by is the evolution of a founder in a business.
Yeah.
Because naturally when a business succeeds, it grows like your business grew. You eventually were acquired or you merged and then you took a position, global director.
Yeah. Yeah, 32 countries, 4,500 people.
Yep.
Most of them didn't listen to me. That was a revelation. Yeah.
One piece that founders sometimes get and sometimes don't is the transition into an executive. And again, there are often different skill sets.
Yeah.
I'd love to understand your
Well,
thoughts
it's a big
on
issue.
that.
You know,
Yeah.
I've been in YPO, Young
Yes.
Presidents, since 90. And and I would say it's not some, I'd say 50% of founders suffer at certain stages of growth. And the key is self-talk, I think. And really it's an individual conversation you have to with yourself about letting go. So there's ego involved. You know, when I used to recruit for founders and they say, Andrew, I'm working too hard, too many hours, I need someone, a general manager, understudy, you know. But I used to say, well, are you prepared to accept that you, the unrepeatable miracle, has to let go? And because I was a founder and a YPR, I could talk to them like that because they wouldn't accept that from, you know, someone who was potentially an employee. But I mean, that was the key thing. So learning to let go. What parts do I hang on to and what parts do I let go? But you've got to let go to a lot if you want to grow, because by definition, you're delegating and pushing it down. So I decided in Morgan and Banks, what's the best job? What was the most important job? So for me, it was hiring great people and winning new customers. So that's all I focused on. Oh, and once we were public, I had to focus on the market. So that's all I did. Nothing else. I'd hire people to do everything else, and then I'd have a dashboard or control mechanisms so I could check that what I thought was happening was happening. So good, I'm a great data guy, I love data. Listen not to what they say, watch what they do, count everything, measure everything. So I think with a good dashboard, like if you were a pilot, you wouldn't be flying without a dashboard, altitude, fuel. Same with the business. So have a good dashboard and then learn to let go and work out what you're best at. And by the way, some founders, you know, should maybe be in a role that isn't the CEO. They're better over here, you know, promoting or technology-wise. Maybe they're the inventor and they're the scientist. So just, you know, be realistic about that and don't let your ego get in the way and kid yourself that you know it all. Plus, of course, change is inevitable. And so younger people will come along and do things differently to you, and guess what? Better. Love that. Don't resent it.
Do you think co-CEOs work?
Well, we were the first public company with 2 joint managing directors, Jeff and I, and the analysts didn't like it, the staff. Who do I report to, all that stuff?
Especially back then. It's a lot more popular now.
Exactly. It worked for us because Jeff and I never let anyone divide us. And we also agreed, you do this and I'll do that. So we separated our particular roles. He had certain verticals in the recruiting business. He was a specialist in sales and marketing, pharmaceutical. I was more left brain, given my medical training, science, technology, banking and finance. So we had that. And then, you know, sort of general conversations about things across the whole business, you know, expanding offices or whatever. We had a general rule, which was if one of us don't like something and feel strongly about it, that's it, we won't do it. It's not, you know, let's not get caught up in that. So I think it's about getting that mutual agreement and respect. Otherwise, no, it won't work.
Right. So really looking at, okay, what are my skill sets? What are your skill sets?
Exactly.
Are we a yin and a yang?
Yes.
Or are we 2 yins?
Yeah. And on some things we were 2 yins, and in some things I don't want to know about it. You're better at that than me. Just tell me what you think we should do and I'll follow your lead. I tended to be the public company spokes guy, you know. I understood financial markets, so I tend to be the person who would maybe speak to the analysts a bit more. And, you know, Jeff would have a lot of depth in, you know, running the business and in certain, you know, functional disciplines facing customers, which he was very good at too.
What do you think of the value of a brand, as in the company's brand, and the founder's brand? Because things, again, have changed, right? We're seeing founder-led marketing a lot more, where, especially in recruitment, the workforce are wanting to not work for Facebook, they're wanting to work for Zuckerberg. And he's branding himself really in alignment with the actual company. Whereas previously, like my grandfather, he's like, I want to work for Telco. He wouldn't have even known who was the directors of Telco.
No.
Very, very different now. Have you seen anything like that? Do you have any thoughts on that in the market?
Well, first of all, I think it's rare. I mean, we don't have many Zuckerbergs in the world. And Elon Musk would be another one. I mean, you'd have to think that people at SpaceX, having seen recently with the chopstick catch, they just think Elon Musk is a genius, so I want to work for him. And so that's great. I'm sure Edison was the same in his day. He had the first real incubator, 1,000 patents. Who wouldn't have wanted to work for Edison in those days? But I think for most of us going into the workforce, that's not a factor. And secondly, for founders and most businesses, I think it's a negative. In other words, I, looking back, wished we hadn't been called Morgan and Banks. And I think we should have been called, Great Aussie Recruiter Inc. Because I felt that when, I wasn't in the room, where's the banks? There's a dependency it creates. And I think that feeds back to the issue you had earlier with founders letting go. So I would say, if you think about starting a business, growing it, and then selling it, why the hell would you want your personal brand to be totally tied up in the DNA? Because as a buyer, I'm going to look at your business and say, well, if you don't stay with the business, it's not as valuable. So I think it's counterintuitive. It's all about me. I'm starting a business, strive, strive, strive. But then the further we grew, the irony for me was, as soon as I captured clients, my job was to give them away, push them into the organization, have my great people look after them, and be as far away in the background as I could. That made the company more valuable. If it was all about Andrew Banks and Jeff Morgan till the end, we never would have been worth, the combined businesses got to $6 billion in valuation. As a public company, people would have said, oh, well, what happens if Andrew gets hit by a truck? So fun for a few interesting companies, but generally, if I was growing a business, I wouldn't get my founder brand, as you call it, too entwined in the business.
What do you think of the influencer world, the digital world? There's a lot of entrepreneurs that leverage off their brand on social media. Do you think people buy people more than they buy companies and products?
Well, I mean, something like TikTok, creates a lot of revenue for people, but I think it's about the service or the product more than the
enterprise value.
And the enterprise value
commercially viable
that it's driving. So I like technology doing that, but again, I'd try and keep the personality bit out of it and just focus on the product or service, to make it successful. That's what I'd be focused on, I think. Yeah.
You've spent a lot of time in the US.
9 years, yeah.
9 years in total full-time?
In full-time, yeah. Yeah, and I'm still go back 4 months a year. So my 2 kids live in LA, so I'm very connected to the US.
I'd love to understand what are some of the highlighted differences, and it can be business-wise, but even just culturally, that you've found over your years in the US versus in Australia?
Well, I think it's 360 million people, so that makes a big difference. And I think Australians sometimes miss the scale opportunity. Americans are like us, very diverse. They're, in my personal experience, they're not quite as direct as we think they are. Aussies are very direct. If an Aussie says maybe, he means maybe. If an American says maybe, he can often mean no, which is what you'd expect from a European. So I found that in meetings in America, I had to say to people, now, what have we just agreed? Tell me back, feed it back to me, and confirm to me what we think we're talking about. Because with Aussies, I didn't have to do that. But with Americans, sometimes, because I'd leave the room and I think we're doing something, 30 days later, they go, really? Is that what you wanted? So not quite as direct as we think now. I'm generalizing because California and New York are very different to Texas. Texans, I find the Midwest and the country area much closer to Australia's mentality. I think it's something to do with sophisticated cities in a farm, Chicago, and Sydney Australia is very much about sophisticated cities, surrounded by big land, farms and stuff. So that sort of directness and earthiness I find in the South and the Mid. But I think I like the enthusiasm of Americans generally, and the one thing I think that we can learn from them is the fast fail mentality, which is that they don't. He went bankrupt. Here going bankrupt. No, people that was it. You've finished. Your whole career, come off it. In America, they'd look at that and go, no, he tried, he failed, but he didn't steal anything. He just didn't work. So he's off on another round. Good luck to him. And I think that ability to reinvent themselves and be positive and move forward is a great characteristic as a country. And I wish sometimes Australia would be a bit more positive that way. Although I think we're getting there. We're better than we were 20 years ago,
Yes.
I think.
Yes.
And that's to do with young people like you,
And exposure and access, right? Online.
Yeah, and the differences of our global communities merge a little bit because of that social media constant access.
Do you think it's a valuable move for, let's just say you're a high school leaver, you've got entrepreneurial characteristics, you're wanting to get into business. Do you think it's valuable to go and head over to the US for a little bit and experience what a big market actually feels like?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be the US; it could be the UK. But I think if you're studying, try and do a bit of a studies tour overseas. I definitely think work experience offshore is great. Not just swanning around with a backpack, which is fun, and you can do that socially, and learning about cultures, which is important. But I think actually trying to get an internship. Don't pay me, but I just want to come and work, at your company for 6 weeks through contacts. I think it's a very smart idea because it makes you reflect when you come back on things, and you just don't take them for granted. You go, oh, that's interesting. That wouldn't have happened, in the US if I did that here, and so on.
How much of your success would you put down to what you know versus who you know?
Well, I'd say 90% is what you know. I mean, we talk about, it's who you know. But if you think about that, if someone rings you and says, look, we used to go to school together and I remember you at university, and now I want you to invest in my company, or I need you to be a customer, you're going to judge them on their merits, I think. So I think that's one thing, social media and technology, we're interconnected. So yes, we can connect on LinkedIn and we can say hi, but at the end of the day, we can also get the data and be a bit more dispassionate. So I would say there's a missing piece to what you know and who you know. And I would say my personal success, which I didn't know at the time, but I look back and say, God, I now realize I'm good at that, is what I call connecting the dots. So I think it's, somebody says to me, and this is what recruiters do, find me the CEO of an AI company. So I think, where do I start? So I think, who talks to AI companies? Well, tech companies or people who fund AI companies. So I start talking to them and say, who do we know who's really good? And then I get names and then I end up talking to someone, and then I refine it and I put up a short list. So I've learned that, okay, I know these people. That's who I know. This is what I know. That's the goal I'm trying to achieve. And I put the right two together at the right time. So in other words, I know who to call about what, because of what I know, but also who I know, to then make them a proposition or ask them a question which fills a gap for me. And that helps me get to the next point of my journey. So I think combining who you know and what you know and learning how to put those together is a skill that I learned and developed. And that's helped me a lot.
It's a fascinating topic. Yep. It's interesting as well from a recruitment standpoint, because it's a globalized economy now. You can have a business in Australia and your staff can be all through Eastern Europe. Your customers can be in the United States.
If I had told my grandmother that there was a thing called a web and you upload your life's history and experience onto it with a resume, and jobs can find you because you can wake up in the morning and have something in your inbox saying, come and look at this job in Canada, she would have said, impossible, science fiction. And yet that's the reality of today.
You've starred on how many seasons of Shark Tank so far?
Starred. I was one of the 5 sharks, 48 episodes. We did 4 years in a row. And then we all got a bit tired. We'd invested in a lot of stuff. And then I think Channel 10 lost the franchise for a year or two, and then they brought it back. So yeah, 48 episodes.
Good fun.
Over 4 years. Great fun. Learned a lot. I was living in America at the time. So for me, it did 2 things. It kept me connected to the US, because if you remember, to Australia. So I was the Aussie shark, but I lived in the States, and That meant a lot of people who pitched wanted to get into that market. But the second thing for me is I'd sold my last public company, Talent 2, and I was toying with what do I do in my 60s and 70s. And the traditional route is boards, right? And I didn't really want to do boards of public companies unless it was my own or I had a lot of shares in it. And so Shark Tank helped me realize my pathway was VC investing. So coaching entrepreneurs and startups, but not being on the boards of public companies and investing in them.
Have you got an active portfolio now still?
Yeah, I've got probably 10 active companies. Some are just, spitting out cash and very traditional businesses, like a golf range. We own the most modern golf range in the Southern Hemisphere at Thornley in Sydney. I'm half owner of that with Steve, which is great business, and I love golf. Through to, seed investments that have become first round, second round. The ones that went bust have long since gone bust. I think I've got one 3x unicorn in the US, which I'm waiting for an exit, and then one half a unicorn, and then the rest are various stages of development. I'm in the foot care industry with Sync Body, so lots of different things, and they make it interesting for me. So, typical week would be 10 or 20 hours of talking to founders and providing coaching advice or answering their questions.
Are there any sectors that excite you at the moment?
Well, I think AI excites me. One of my investments, we were talking this morning in the HR software Compono, which is we've got some. We basically, if you apply for a learner's permit here in Queensland, you're going through Compono, and it's interactive, but it also does language translation. So a number of the modules in Compono to create content would take 3 weeks. They're now 3 hours using AI. So some interesting exposure to some clever technology, which makes Compono a cutting edge with state governments on that side of things. So I like what technology can do. To me, it's like a parallel universe. You think of, well, I can't get a digital coffee, although I can get online a coffee delivered. And then if you think about all the things that used to happen in the analog or the physical universe, atoms, they're expensive, bytes are cheap. So the first digital revolution 20, 30 years ago, there were so many obvious opportunities. I probably missed a few. I had jobs. If I knew what I knew now, I should have had cars and houses as well. That'd add another 15 billion to the portfolio. So you think of it, and it's not going to end. AI is going to accelerate certain parts of it, but we've still got a long way to go, I think, to take inefficient aspects of trade and communication and digitize them and turn them into new businesses.
Do you think Australia sits behind the United States in that front, or because most of it's online, it's pretty like for like?
We've caught up a lot.
Okay.
And we do a lot of things well. I mean, the scale of the US is always astounding. A Facebook had to be born in the US because of their college system and their scale. But I think we shouldn't be feeling inferior in Australia. And there's some things about the size of our market make it a bit easier to kind of get access and get some traction. A SpaceX, obviously, and I think there's sort of the less regulated world of the US makes other things possible there. But I think we're doing up. We're catching up. I was at a biotech conference in Sydney last week, and there were some real experts there, some investors from the US, and they were saying they cannot believe that there's as many investment opportunities in biotech coming out of Australia, material development, medical, scientific, than they see in the US. And that was from an American VC. So, what we've got to do is make sure we capitalize on them here and not do what CSIRO had to do and sell Wi-Fi to the world before. I mean, just imagine how, it would have moved the needle on our GDP if we still owned Wi-Fi and we were, getting a margin on that around the world every day.
How much, as an investor and a founder, how much value do you assign to building the best product in a market versus, as a startup, having a strong distribution / path to market plan when you're analysing an opportunity that's, pre-rev or early rev?
Well, I probably look at it, the first thing is market. How big's the market? Forget product and distribution. How big's the market? Are we in the pink pajama market, which is sort of that big, or are we in, everything to do with nightwear, which is that big, concept? And then I think, so I look at the size of the market, then who's in it now? And are we competing? Do we have to take market share? Or are we creating a new market?
Innovating.
So, for example, I'm an investor in Lyre's, the non-alcoholic spirits. Carl Hartman, who's a Queenslander here, is the founder of that with Mark. And you'd think that's all about people who don't want to drink alcohol and don't want sugar. But there's a hidden market in the iceberg. 500,000 Mexican restaurants in America who don't have a liquor license now are getting non-alcoholic margaritas, which is a bigger margin than their tacos. Think of that. So there's a hidden part of that market. You're not competing, you're educating, re-educating. So I look at all of the players and then I say to the entrepreneur, or look at the opportunity, the investment. So how are you going to fit with that? What's your competitive advantage? That's product. And then how do you get there? And the distribution part and how you get there is very important, because a lot of great products and great markets, they can't get there because there's intermediaries or there's blockages, various things that stop them. So I think you're right. It's important, but I think that's the analysis is of the total aspect there to be comfortable that I should invest.
One of, I guess, the difficulties entrepreneurs face is entrepreneurship encapsulates your whole life. It's not a job. It's very hard to go in at 9 and leave at 5. Are there any strategies or, I guess, habits that you've implemented to kind of nurture your family and keep all aspects of your life holistically operating together whilst, audaciously pursuing all of your business endeavors?
It's a great question, and I don't think it's just family. I think that comes back to health, physical and mental health too. Because, I don't know about you, but this body gets me to meetings, carries my head. It's kind of important. So for the last 15 years, I've been focused on making sure it stayed as fit as it could do. So that's thinking about diet, how much alcohol, fitness, having a regime. Because I definitely think hardworking entrepreneurs who've, you look at and we read about a few in the papers even recently, really bad decisions. And I think that's because they haven't got balance in their personal physical life. So they get stressed one day and they make really poor decisions. Family, I knew I was going to work 60 to 70 hours a week. I had a contract with my wife, Andrea, and my kids. I'd sort of almost tell them from basically Monday through Thursday, you might not see a lot of me. I'd always try to be home for dinner on Friday, and I'd definitely try and keep the weekends free. Maybe I'd do a bit of work Sunday afternoons to catch up. So I definitely make time. And then every 2 or 3 months, I'd try and get away with my partner and my wife and sort of just have time there to, I cheated a bit and had Tricia, who's worked with me for 40 years, make sure I had flowers ready to collect on a Friday. And I'd always walk in the house on a Friday with some flowers, which my wife knew that I hadn't bought them, and it was but it was still a nice thing to do. So I think I tried to create some balance. But in the end, I had pleaded guilty and I was driven. And I knew I was going to work hard. And it wasn't about making money, but about being successful and being financially independent was important. And there's a price you have to pay. So in an interview, I've done 40,000 interviews, remember. If someone sat down for me and said, I'm a really upwardly mobile, ambitious executive, but I want you to know, Andrew, my family is important to me. It's a really bad start, because I'd say, well, so's oxygen, thank you. Tell me something I don't already know. But let's not start the conversation about your family's important to you. Of course they are. But, what do you want out of life? And if you're driven and you're going to work hard and you want to be, there will be some sacrifices, and you won't be a 9-to-5 person all the time, because that can't be your priority. I'm not saying that's wrong, You know, if I had an aging mother and I was the only support and I was at a different stage in my life and I was caring for her, I'd probably go and get a job working for the public sector, doing 25 hours a week, no stress. Nothing wrong with that. But that isn't me and wasn't me then. So make the choices. Don't apologize for being ambitious and hardworking, but do have a balance.
Do you think, out of all of the interviews you've done, out of all of the roles you've assigned, do you think, and I'm going to say the word success, it's a bit broad, but do you think people are, you're born to be successful?
No.
You think that they're made?
Yeah. I don't think. I mean, I was late. 29 is really when I started to make money and found out. I mean, look at me. I failed at medicine and applied biology. Then I emigrate to Australia. Then I act for 2 years. Then I had a restaurant. Everything I did on the way after the, not studying anymore was successful in its own way. But then I was in HR with Brown and Root. Then I moved to London. I can remember my first salary in London was £6,000 a year, and I was 23. So I don't think but I sort of then suddenly at 29 found out what I was really good at. So I think we're all looking for that intersection between what I'm good at, what I'm passionate about, what does the world need. That's the intersection. Some people get it early, some people get it late. So I think try and make every day a winner. But no, I think you can grow into that. I definitely grew into what you would see as my success. Funnily enough, I look at myself and I compare myself to others, and I don't think I'm that successful. Well, if I had 10 billion, I might think but anyway, so we're always, and that's part of my competitive spirit maybe. I always think I could have done a bit better and tried a bit harder.
And probably a reflection of the rooms you're in.
Yeah, probably. But I still am grateful that I found something. And one other thing, back to those interviews, 90%, sadly, of the people I interviewed as a recruiter didn't love their jobs. Only about 10% got out of bed every morning and punched the air. And I always felt my goal as a recruiter was to find that right job for that person so they could move into that 10% where I love what I do and I enjoy going to work every day. And so I'm grateful for that, because I do feel that 95% of my working life has been in that space and is now.
Do you think there's any really bad advice in the market at the moment? Because again, we've got access to so much information, but also everyone's now got permission to consult and to give advice due to social media. Do you think there's any, broadly speaking, advice that's become a trend that, young people getting into business just lap up, that you just go?
That's an interesting question. I mean, I would say the danger of all that social media advice isn't necessarily a piece of bad advice, but maybe forgetting to follow your own advice, which is listen, absorb what you can, but at the end of the day, trust your own judgment and back yourself, and if you feel that something just doesn't intuitively feel right for you, then don't do it. So I think you've got to back yourself. You've got to have the strength of character to say, no, you know what, I know that's what they're all saying, but that's not right for me. I mean, the change of work, COVID, all that stuff of, I've got to work from home. And you hear a lot of CEOs saying, well, look, everybody now wants to work from home. They tell me the terms in an interview, what should I do? And I go, it's your business. And if you feel people should turn up in the office 3 days a week, then they're the rules. That's, you decide that. And because you feel that's going to be better for your customers and for your business. So don't say, people say that you can't insist people should come to the office. Well, forget what people say. You run the business the way you think you'd run it. And then you've only got yourself to blame or thank if you do well. So I think it's more, don't get caught up in this noise of social media and if it just doesn't feel right for you.
Cool. I have one last exciting segment.
Okay, let's do it.
It's called This or That.
This or That.
So I'm going to give you two words.
2 words.
And you
right.
pick one. Okay. Whichever one comes to mind first, whichever one you prefer.
Okay.
And then we'll move on.
Right.
Commercial real estate or residential real estate?
Commercial.
Starting a business or buying a business?
Starting a business.
Sales or marketing?
Sales.
The UK or the US?
US.
Sydney or New York?
Tough. Oh, Sydney for living, New York for business.
Books or films?
Films.
Wisdom or wealth?
Wisdom. Enduring quality.
And the best one, Glenn or Steve?
I love them both. They're very different. And Steve's much more lovable than he appears on television.
Thanks, Andrew. Been a pleasure. Everything that you've done, achieved, and continue to achieve is inspirational to everyone, fortunately in the UK and the US, but most importantly in Australia.
Thanks.
So
It's great to be here.